Hello, I'm Dr. Rich Blana, your host for the Healthy Stress Doctor Pod Show. Welcome to the 6th edition of the Pod Show. In this edition, I'm going to talk about my most recent newsletter and the idea of looking back at your journals. Now that you've started keeping your stressor journal, I really want you to start paying attention to two things. One is how you rate the threat associated with your potential stressors, and two, how you rate your ability to cope with the threat. Remember, in the journal, you have to rate each potential stressor on a scale of 1 to 10 regarding how threatening it is to you, and then also on a scale of 1 to 10, how able you feel you are to cope with the threat. You need to really start being more mindful of how accurately you gauge threat and your ability to cope with it. Do you overestimate, underestimate, or accurately gauge the threat associated with a potential stressor and your ability to cope with it? Those are the two key questions in that appraisal process that determines whether a potential stressor becomes an actual stressor. So now that you're starting to record this data, I want you to really start looking at it a little bit more critically. Remember, even if something really is threatening, if you feel you can cope with it, it won't become a stressor. It actually might become a challenge to you. In this month's newsletter, I talk about the value of hindsight, or being able to look backward, and the value of that in the learning process involving how to more accurately gauge your threat and your ability to cope with it. When you can look back at how you rated something in your journal, it gives you the ability to step back and distance yourself from that potential stressor and that whole transaction that went on. What I find is that most of my students, when they look back at their journals, they're amazed at how they overestimated the threat involved in some of their potential stressors and how they really underestimated their ability to cope with this threat. When they look back now, 1, 2, or 3 months later, at something they rated an 8 or 9, they kind of chuckle at how, in actuality, with hindsight, it really was a 2 or 3. So hindsight and the ability to look backward can be a really, really powerful teacher and teaching tool, and I'd like you to use it, and that's why you're keeping these journals. In the coming months, I'll teach you new skills on how to really accurately gauge threat and how to really assess more accurately, more logically, the threat involved in your potential stressors. I'll also teach you new coping skills, and you'll have your own little personal toolkit of stress management coping skills. So armed with new coping skills, you should feel more able to cope with a greater variety of potential stressors. And that's the key, having more tools, empowering yourself with the ability to cope, and hopefully that'll reduce the threat associated with potential stressors in the future. And down the road, we'll ultimately build your own personal stress management plan based on how you perceive your potential stressors and what coping strategies work for you. So I look forward to working with you in the future, and I hope you tune in next month for the next edition of this podcast, where we start to really look at some new skills for accurately gauging threat. Thanks, and I'll see you next month.